The previous two sections of Chapter 8 dealt with how process costing firms would use the weighted average method. Most firms that do process costing do use the weighted average method because it's easier. However, I want you to understand how the FIFO method, first in, first out, would be applied to process costing because it's actually a superior method that gives firms a little bit more information that might be useful to them. So we're going to take the same exact fact pattern that we had in the mixing department, the first department in our hypothetical firm. And in this department, we started out with 1,000 units that were 40% complete, and we know that that related to their conversion costs because materials were all added at the beginning of the process. And during the period, the firm started an additional 5,000 units. At the end of the period, there were 400 units in work in process ending balance, and they were 30% complete for conversion costs, but obviously 100% complete for materials. We are also given the costs for the materials and the conversion that are incorporated in the work in process beginning balance, and also the costs that are added during the period. Now, the FIFO method makes a very realistic assumption. It assumes that the work in process units that were started last period and are sitting there when our workers come in on the first day of the new period, those units will be finished before any new units are started. Because of that, we need to consider both the input side and the output side of our fishbone diagram. So let's take a look at it. Go from what you know to what you don't know. We were told that there was a beginning balance of 1,000 units and that 5,000 additional units were started during the period. This gives us a total of 6,000 units that we need to explain. Now, what do we know for sure? We know a couple of things. We know that the 1,000 units that were already in work in process will be finished before any new units are started. We also know that there were 400 units that didn't get finished during the period. So if we have 6,000 units and 1,000 of them came from the work in process beginning balance and 400 of them didn't get finished, that means that an additional 4,600 units must have been started and completed during the period. This means that we need to consider the costs associated with 3 different kinds of units on the output side. Units that were started last period and finished this period, that was our 1,000 units, and units that were started and finished during this period, that was the 4,600 units, and units that were started this period but not finished. That's the 400 units that are left in ending work in process at the end of this period and will become our beginning work in process for the following period. In step 2, we need to consider the equivalent units. But in FIFO, we are only considering equivalent units for materials or conversion costs that are added in this period. We are treating the old costs that were added previously separately, and I will show you how that's done in another step. So let's think first about the work in process beginning inventory, those 1,000 units that were started last period and are going to be the first ones to be finished this period. Those units got their materials in the previous period. Therefore, we only need to consider any additional materials that are added in this period. Similarly, they already got some conversion costs in the previous period. So we only need to consider conversion costs that are added in this period. So for materials, these units were already 100% complete because materials are added at the beginning of the process. Therefore, these particular 1,000 units did not need any additional materials added in this period. Now, what about conversion costs? Well, we were told that these 1,000 units were already 40% complete for conversion. They got 40% of their conversion costs in the previous period. Therefore, they only need an additional 60% of their conversion costs. Therefore, 1,000 units times the 60% that they needed in order to become complete this period equals 600 equivalent units for conversion. Next, what about the units that were started and completed in this period? Obviously, they got 100% of their materials and they got 100% of their conversion. So the 4,600 physical units that were started and completed in this period would equal 4,600 equivalent units for both materials and conversion costs. Now let's consider the units that are in the work in process ending balance. Those units must have gotten 100% of their materials because materials are added at the beginning of this process. So they are worth 400 equivalent units for materials. But we're told that those units are only 30% complete for conversion. 400 physical units times 30% completion in this period equals 120 equivalent units. Now, all we have to do is add up the total number of equivalent units for materials and add up the total number of equivalent units for conversion. And we're ready to go on to step 3. Step 3 is where we identify all of the costs. So this step is going to be done in the same way as it is done for the weighted average method. We know the dollar value of materials in our work in process beginning balance. We can add the materials that were added in March. That gives us our total materials. We can do the same thing for conversion costs. We can add across to get the total dollar value of the work in process at the beginning of the period and the total amount of costs added during the period, we can also add down to get the total amount of materials costs and the total amount of conversion costs. We can add both ways to get the total cost that we need to explain, $207,424. Next, we need to figure out the cost per equivalent unit. In the FIFO method, we are going to treat old costs separately. So, to compute the cost per equivalent unit, we are only going to focus on new costs that were added in this period, and we're going to divide that by new equivalent units that were added in this period. So, the first thing I did was copy the costs for materials and conversion and the total for current costs in this period only. That came from step 3. Then I went back and took a look at the equivalent units for this period. That came from step 2. We had figured out that there were 5,000 equivalent units for materials added in this period, not counting anything that was added in the past. When we divide current equivalent units into current costs, we get a number, $12.10 per equivalent unit for materials that are added in this period. We can play the same game with conversion costs. In step 2, we had figured out that there were 5,320 equivalent units for conversion in the current period. Divide current period equivalent units into current period costs, and it gives us a number, $24.60 per equivalent unit for conversion added in this period. Then if we want to, we can add across, and that tells us that in this period it cost us $36.70 per equivalent unit of current costs. Of course, nothing goes in that space, and here is one of the benefits of FIFO. We can compare how much it cost us for materials, for conversion, and in total under FIFO to what it cost us under the weighted average method that we did in Part A of Chapter 8. In that section, we found that for the weighted average method, we paid an average of $11.50 for materials. Here, we find that it cost us $12.10, considering only current costs. That tells us that the cost per equivalent unit for materials has gone up. And that's something we might like to investigate. We might want to look into our buying practices. We might want to look around for another supplier, or we might want to consider increasing the price on our product. Similarly, for conversion costs under the weighted average method, which combines old costs with new costs, we had a cost of $24.20 per equivalent unit for conversion costs. Under the FIFO method, we can see that it cost us $24.60 per equivalent unit for current conversion costs. That's a 40-cent increase, and we might want to think about why that happened. Finally, we can take a look at the total cost, and we see that it's gone up $1, 60 cents in increased materials costs and 40 cents in increased conversion costs that we would not have been able to perceive if we had used the weighted average method. It would have happened. Our costs went up, but we wouldn't be able to see it. Remember that you can't control costs that you can't see. One of the benefits of the FIFO method is that it helps to make these cost fluctuations visible. Of course, one of the reasons that firms prefer to use the weighted average method is that it tends to smooth fluctuations in costs between one period and the next, and firms prefer to have a smoother change in costs because they feel that it smooths their income, which makes investors feel more confident. So, by using FIFO, we were able to perceive these costs. Whether the firm wants to consider that is a managerial choice. Now we're in step 5, where we need to determine what happened to all of these costs. For the units that were transferred out, we now need to consider the costs that were already incorporated in our work in process beginning balance. That information was given to us. Now we need to add in the cost to complete the work in process beginning balance. That is going to be the cost per equivalent unit times the number of equivalent units for materials, and then again for conversion costs. For materials, there were no materials that were added to the work in process beginning balance because they had already gotten 100% of their materials in the previous period. For conversion costs, we said that there were 600 equivalent units. That was 1,000 physical units that had already gotten 40% of their conversion in a previous period and now got 60% of their conversion in the current period. So that's 600 equivalent units times the conversion cost per equivalent unit. And we can add that up. That's the total amount of new costs added to complete the work in process beginning balance. Now we can add up to find the total costs in these units that were started in a previous period, were sitting around in work in process at the beginning of this period, and got finished and transferred out during the period. We can add up for materials and for conversion and in total. Next, we need to consider the units that were started and completed in this period. Since they were both started and finished in this period, they must have gotten 100% of all of their costs in this period. So, for materials, there were 4,600 equivalent units times the cost per unit for materials. For conversion, there were 4,600 equivalent units times the cost per unit for conversion, and we can add those together to find the total amount of current costs embodied in these units. Now we can determine how much cost to assign to the units that got finished and were transferred out by adding up the cost for materials in both the units that were started last period and finished this period, and in the units that were started and completed this period. We can do the same thing for conversion costs. All of the conversion costs in the units that were in work in process at the beginning of the period, and all of the new conversion costs added to the units that we started and completed during the period. And we can add these up in total. That is the dollar value of the units that were transferred out. Now we can write our journal entry. We'll credit work in process in the mixing department for $199,632, and we will debit, increase the work in process in the next department, the packaging department. Now we can look at our work in process ending inventory. We know that those units represented 400 physical units. Those units must have gotten 100% of their materials because materials are added at the beginning of the process. So we can multiply 400 equivalent units times the cost per unit for materials. And we can do the same thing for conversion, but remember, those units were only 30% complete for conversion. So 400 units, 30% complete, represent 120 equivalent units for conversion, and then multiply that times the cost per unit for conversion. Add these up. That represents the dollar value for all of the units in work in process ending inventory for the period. And that's the amount that will show up on the balance sheet for the mixing department. Now, we can finish checking our work by looking at the total cost on the output side. We can add up the materials cost in the units that got done plus the materials cost in the units that didn't get done, and that must equal the total materials cost in step 3, and it does. We can do the same thing for conversion costs. Conversion costs in the units that got done plus conversion costs in the units that didn't get done must equal total conversion costs in step 3. Finally, the dollar value of the units that got done plus the dollar value of the units that didn't get done must equal our total cost from step 3, and it does. Now, let's use our fishbone diagram to take a look at what happened to all of our costs. We started out with a little over $16,000 of materials and conversion costs already in our work in process beginning balance, and we know this from step 3. During the period, we added another $191,372 of new costs. We can add that up all together. That tells us the total dollar value of all materials and conversion costs that we worked on during the period. Under the FIFO method, we assign $199,632 worth of costs to the units that are transferred out, and the rest of the costs are left in our work in process ending balance. Here are T accounts to show you what work in process would look like under the weighted average method and under the FIFO method. And you'll notice they're very similar to each other, but they are not exactly the same. If we look at the ending balance, we see that ending work in process under FIFO is higher than it is under the weighted average method. That happened because our costs went up during the period, and the FIFO method makes sure that all old costs are assigned to units that get done. So the ending balance contains only new costs. By contrast, the weighted average method mixes together the old costs and the new costs. That's why it's a little lower, because it contains some old costs along with some new costs. Similarly, the dollar value for the units that were transferred out is a little higher under the weighted average method than it is under FIFO. FIFO makes sure that all old costs are assigned to units that get done. That means the dollar value of the units that get done is going to be a little bit lower because it contains all of the old costs, which are lower. In this case, prices went up. Both of these methods are acceptable under GAAP. All GAAP asks is that a firm pick a method and stick with it so that costs won't be distorted by fluctuating between one method and the other. FIFO is slightly trickier to use. Very few firms choose it, but it gives information that would be hidden under the weighted average method. The last thing in this chapter that I wanted to mention is something called operations costing. It's simply a hybrid of job order costing and process costing, and it's used in manufacturing firms in which there are some characteristics that are like process, the same thing happening over and over and over again, and some characteristics that are more like job costing, where things are very specific. An operation is considered to be a set of steps that are repeated in order to make a product. So, within that operation, uniform costs are going to be assigned to all of the units for that operation using process costing, but unique costs can be assigned using job order costing. In other words, the materials are going to be different, but many of the conversion costs are going to be the same. An example of an industry that would use operations costing would be the automobile industry. There are many things that are similar about producing all models of cars for a particular manufacturer, but there are lots of costs that are unique, that make the models different from each other.